Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Hamza. I have a team helping me today. We have Jess, who will be taking care of the logistics and technical side of the webinar. Sean, who will be monitoring the chat and posting relevant links throughout. And we have Katie, who will be collecting a few questions from the audience and sending them to me. All of us are part of the Transnational Institute, TNI. TNI is an international research and advocacy institute committed to building a just, democratic, and sustainable planet. For more than 40 years, TNI has served as a unique nexus between social movements, engaged scholars, and policymakers. We've been organizing an amazing series of weekly webinars with great speakers since April 1st. And as you can imagine, this comes at a cost. So any support you can offer to help us doing that work will be much appreciated. I'd like now to give a bit of a context to today's discussions. 10 years ago, in the region we call the Middle East and North Africa, or the Arab region, or the Arab-speaking world, or what I prefer to call North Africa and West Asia, we've seen how waves of uprisings swept away Western-backed tyrants one after the other. First, Tunisia's Ben Ali, then Egypt's Mubarak, and it seemed that the list was bound to continue. These uprisings were unforgettable historical events, and the emancipatory experience was so contagious that people all over the world were inspired. Occupiers from London to Wall Street were proud to work like an Egyptian. This revolutionary process that has been driven by demands for bread, freedom, dignity, and social justice has seen ups and downs, gains and setbacks, which materialized in a liberal democratic transition in Tunisia and bloody counter-revolutions and imperialist interventions in other countries. This led some observers to pronounce a death sentence on the so-called Arab Spring and suggest it has become an Arab winter. However, a decade later, the same conditions that sparked the first wave of the Arab uprisings, notably the combination of economic injustices, neoliberal dispossession, and political authoritarianism, led to another regional revolt that may be ushering a new phase of profound change in the region. This time it started from Sudan in December 2018 and spread to Algeria in February 2019, and then to Iraq and Lebanon in October of the same year. We saw massive popular movements erupting onto the political stage, demanding radical change and achieving some historical gains. But these movements find themselves pitted against entrenched authoritarian and counter-revolutionary forces that do everything to crush them and bury them, including in times of COVID-19. So to shed some light on all of these processes and actors, we have an amazing panel of speakers today. But before I introduce the first speaker, I just wanted to let you know that you can share relevant links and materials in the chat. And if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window to make Katie's task of collecting questions much easier. Each panelist will speak for about 7 minutes, after which I will open the discussion before taking some questions from the audience. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker. Muzan Alneel is a Sudanese engineer, political activist, and blogger. She is one of the main critical voices currently in Sudan, exposing discrepancies in the recent political arrangements in the country. Welcome, Muzan. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Hamza. So as you said, I will be sharing highlights from the revolution in my home country, Sudan, which is an Arabophone country. That is a term I would like to use more than Arab for a country that predominantly communicates in Arabic. And although the term excludes some minorities, it does not force an Arab identity on a country that does not necessarily identify as one just because we speak the language. There's a slideshow that I would like to share with you. And starting, we will talk about the Sudanese revolution and given some, if we can go through with the slides, I'll be given some details about the background in Sudan. Sorry, Jess, would you please go to the next slide? Okay, so since our independence almost 60 years ago, Sudan lived a total of only 11 years of democracies. You see in your left a photo of our first military ruler. The first coup was by Aboud, who left and was ousted by the revolution of 1964, and then the second coup by Nimeri, ousted by the revolution of 1985, and then the third coup by al-Bashir, which was ousted after 30 years by the revolution. That is our topic for today. So you see, we are very good at revolutions, but we're also very good at losing our democracies and failing our revolutions, and I hope we'll get to some of the reasons why throughout this discussion. Next slide, please. Now, this is an iconic picture that is of the revolution of December 2018 that brought down the third military ruler. And this is a photo of the ruling party headquarters being burned in the city of Atbara. It showed us that they are weak, they can be brought down. And at this time, there were already some protests against the dire economical situation and directly against the doubling of the prices of bread in the country. The protests that started in the city of Atbara then took over the country in the month of January and February, and the protests were called for by the Sudanese professional associations, and barricades and burnt tires were the weapons of the protesters. At this time, the violence from the state was increasing. They announced a state of emergency, and we see that on our left over here is a photo of a protester who lost his hand. Previous slide, please. Just sorry. Who lost his hand throwing back a tear gas canister, and only to be protesting again a few days later, holding up his injured arm. On our right is DIY crafts that were made out of tear gas canisters and bullets that were trending between the protesters. So we fought the violence of the state in different ways. Then we go to the month of March, and this was the month of the civil disobedience, the one-day civil disobedience that the protesters announced in any way possible, writing on walls and doors and so on. And it was very risky at this time. The civil disobedience came with a new tool, that is the Revolutionary Attendance Book. This is a tool that was created and initiated by the Sudanese Professionals Association, and it was basically a call for professional bodies to announce their commitment to participate in the strike. And many did, as you see over here. Doctors on your right, workers from the hydroelectric dams on the left. We had confirmation that the strike will be a success even before it started. In neighborhoods, there was another campaign that was happening in March, that is the We Will Build It campaign, where people cleaned and planted trees in their neighborhoods, and this helped with the networking and organizing that later on created the neighborhood resistance committees that later organized the protest. And we continued protesting in the month of April, and on the 6th of April, which is the anniversary of the 1985 protest, we marched towards the army headquarters. And this is the march that turned into a 58-day sit-in in 15 cities around Sudan that gave us the beautiful revolutionary art that the world saw. It gave us amazing scenes of young soldiers reading political pamphlets and participating in the political process in a way that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And it gave us surreal scenes of the train of Atbara that carried protesters across Sudan to join the sit-in. And under this pressure, the military leaders, they performed a coup against Bashir. They brought him down and created the Transitional Military Council that started negotiations with the political opposition. Now then came the month of May. And in May we had the general political strike, and we were strong enough to call for it in the streets, in main streets, as you saw in the previous photo. And this is a strike where workers from all over Sudan participated. It was a 2-day strike. You see here central bank employees participated in the strike, and you see shoemakers from the market as well participating in the strike, calling for the civil rule and rejecting the military rule. The airports were closed, the seaports were closed. For 2 days, we had totally closed the country as we demanded civilian rule. Meanwhile, the opposition leadership was still negotiating with the military council. Now, before we go to the next month, which is the month of June, I want to ask a question, which is what happened to the women? What you see on your right is photos from the protests, and those are photos of women of all ages, and young men as well. And on your right is a photo from negotiation tables and the cabinet of the government, the transitional government, a lot of old people and mostly women. So why? What happened to them in Sudan? In my opinion, I would say that one, a misogynistic patriarchal political space that gives no space for women, and two, the lack of a political feminist agenda gives way for such representational policies and United Nations tick boxes of how many female ministers do you have, and that is not a revolution. Now let's go back to our chronological order over here and to the month of June. In June, June was a month of a massacre, started with a massacre, but ended with a punch back from the revolution. On the 3rd of June, the military attacked the sit-in in 14 cities around Sudan, killing protesters, raping them, burning them, throwing bodies in the river. It was fully a massacre. And for weeks after that, the military continued to terrorize the people in the streets, killing people in the streets. They totally shut down the internet for almost 6 weeks. But the protesters still took to the streets with their barricades and with their tires.
Muzan, can you slow a little bit down?
Against the terror of the military and demanding a civilian rule. And so it was. On June 30th, 2019, you see here 7 million Sudanese took to the streets to show power against the terror and the violence and against the massacre demanding a civilian rule. However, regardless of all this strength, we still ended with the power sharing agreement between the military council and the opposition leadership. And I will argue that this is one of the main reasons we in Sudan keep losing our democracies and failing our revolutions. It's a conflict between a strong revolutionary masses that we just saw and a leadership that is compromising, non-revolutionary, and willing to shake hands with the perpetrators of the massacre and hand them back the power that the people fought for. Now, since the agreement, the new government faced the question of justice for all the victims of the regime in 30 years, and justice for the martyrs of the massacre comes at the top of the list for many. And the photos and faces of the martyrs are, as you see, are on the walls of every street in Sudan. They are held up by protesters who are demanding justice. The last moments of the deaths of the martyrs are recreated in theatrical street performance. That tells us that people are not willing to forget. And even at the anniversary of the massacre at the 3rd of June last week, as it came during the time of the pandemics, the resistance committees organized social distance protests and hanged military figures from billboards around the capital, expressing that they will not forget the justice for the martyrs and that they had enough, waiting for more than a year for the trials of the perpetrators of the massacre. And justice for the victims of 30 years of dictatorship also reflects itself in different slogans. We see here justice being defined as the end of war, sending Bashir to the International Criminal Court, and justice being the secular state. We also know that economical justice was already an issue since we said at the beginning, and the dire economical situation is what gave us photos such of these. These are kids from the resistance committee.
Muzan, you have only 30 seconds left.
Sure thing.
Yeah.
They accumulated these tools from protesting that they are now using to provide bread and cooking gas and other essentials for the population of their neighborhood. And they also used it fighting the pandemic. And although for almost 3 months now, the resistance committees have stopped all protests because of the pandemic, they are calling now again for another Millions March on the 30th of June under the slogan, correcting the path of the revolution. Now, I will leave you finally with the final quote from an article that we'll be sharing the full link for too as well. And I would like to say that this article was written last year after protests that were under the slogan, correcting the path of the revolution and supported the transitional government. And it argued that if the government continued to deprioritize justice and for the sake of its agreement with the military and stabilizing that the masses are going to drop the second half of the slogan and only go for correcting the path of the revolution without any support for the transitional government. And this is what we're seeing happen now in the 30th of June within this month. Thank you very much. I hope I did not exceed my time.
Thanks, Muzan. Thanks for for these insights and great pictures that you shared with us. I can see some similarities with Egypt and Algeria, especially when it comes to the preponderant and reactionary role that the military institution has been playing. So this takes us to our next speaker. Brahim Rouabeh is an Algerian activist, co-founder, and former head of the UK Algerian Solidarity Campaign. He is currently a PhD candidate in political science at CUNY and a graduate teaching fellow at Brooklyn College. Welcome, Brahim, and please try to stick to 7 minutes. Thank you. Brahim, unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for making the time to actually be with us today. And thank you to TNI for putting this great panel together and all the sort of the staff that's working behind the scenes to make the webinar possible today. 7 minutes, it's really tough, as you know, to sort of fit in everything. And I think Muzan did a really great job to fit in a lot of stuff there. But I think what I'm gonna do is to set a sort of a broad context, the broad context in which the uprising or the sort of the revolutionary movement comes out in Algeria, and then maybe later on in the Q&A session we can sort of ask or answer particular questions. One thing that I've been trying to think about is how we see the how has the second half of the 20th century and the two first decades of the 21st century been theorized and been understood. And in the context of the third world or the global south, we tend to think about them in terms of sort of post-coloniality, post-colonial states. And there is this idea that independence and decolonization was in some ways a rupture from what came before it, from the colonial system. And I think this way of thinking about history just really blinds us to the continuities and how sort of systems have afterlives and how do they metamorphose and come back in different ways and different shapes. Let us then try and sort of destabilize that notion a little bit, and also to think about what is usually sort of referred to as sort of the rise of neoliberalism and so on, to think about it as a colonial counter-revolution, that it's the colonial system that is coming back in a new form, right? And that manifests itself in the global south in a manner that tries to empty the gains of these revolutions, of the processes of decolonization, to empty them of their content, of their liberatory, emancipatory content. And in the metropoles, i.e. in the triad in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, is to come back, the ruling classes or the capital is coming back to take away the sort of the gains that movements and the struggles in sort of the core had wrenched from it, such as the welfare state, your sort of healthcare and your education being privatized and so on and so forth. So it manifests itself in different ways in different geographical locales. But the aim, or the larger aim, is the same. So here today we're talking about sort of the Arab region or the Arabophone region, as Muzan sort of pointed out. And of course, it goes without saying that these are connected, that there is collective learning from one another. Algerians are learning from Sudanese, from Lebanese, from Iraqis, but also from Chileans, from Cubans, from other sort of struggles. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that sort of later on. Now, the immediate, of course, of course, you all know that the conditions are the same: pauperization, the lack of social justice, the retraction of the state that has happened over the last 3 decades in Algeria, the defunding of social programs, the lifting off of subsidies on essential goods. All these are common threads to these uprisings, and sort of provide a fertile climate in which revolutions or revolutionary sort of movements arise. But also there is a common thread in the sense of, or at least in the analysis of the Algerian movement, is that of military rule. And by military rule, what they are really saying is the concomitant of this colonial counter-revolution is militarism. Militarism manifests itself in different ways. You know, some people would call it a police state. You know, here in the US, for example, people talk about militarized police. You know, where the state, where in these sort of contexts, the state is only experienced or is only dealt with or is only encountered through its repressive apparatuses. And this is, we need to understand that repression or authoritarianism, or you know, is the sort of the necessary concomitant to capitalism or to the capitalist state. There is no other way. It's either you redistribute or you repress to silence the voices these go hand in hand. There is no really no other way for it. It's either, it's just no justice, no peace. That's you know, it's clear. If you have justice, you have peace. If you don't have justice, then you have negative peace, because you're repressing the voices that are in fact raising the issues and putting into question the system that you're putting on. So you know, this is sort of the context within which the uprising happens, or the movement comes into being in Algeria, and initially sort of the immediate cause was really the humiliating sort of putting forward of this military regime, putting forward the same sort of an octogenarian, wheelchair-ridden sort of civilian facade, the president, so-called, well, their president, Bouteflika, for a fifth term, and this humiliation was
Rahim, you have 30 seconds left. Yeah.
Oh, great. So yeah, it's not a problem. We can always come back to this. But really, what you know, the key here is that Algerians feel that their national sovereignty has been surrendered, that their resources have been squandered and plundered by a local comprador military oligarchy that shares more with its counterparts in other sort of northern metropoles than with the majority of Algerians, and they are out calling for an end to military rule, for true and meaningful independence, and for a civilian, deeply democratic political life in which force, when the critique of military rule is really to say that force should have no place in sorting out differences between Algerians. So so-called independence in '62 is seen as the achievement of the liberation of the land. Now this movement is for the liberation and emancipation of the people.
Well, thanks, Brahim. Thanks a lot for these great insights. So we go now from Africa to the Mashriq, and from an oil-rich country to another. We'll hear now from Zahra Ali about Iraq. Zahra Ali is an Iraqi sociologist and feminist based at Rutgers University, and author of Women and Gender in Iraq, that has been published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Zahra, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we are having this conversation, and thank you so much for organizing this. It's really great, and it's really actually very rare that we have the opportunity to discuss these different contexts in relation to each other. So thank you so much. So I'll jump in, and I just want to say regarding Iraq, I'm sure a lot of people are really unaware of what's going on, and I really appreciate the theoretical and analytical insight of Brahim, and I agree so much with it. But maybe I'll start with more general, like providing a picture for people who are curious about what's going on in Iraq. So first, the historical moment that we are experiencing is something that is, of course, as any historical moment, the October 2019 uprising, something that happened as a continuum. It's a process, right? And Iraqis have been rising against authoritarianism and different forms of injustice since so long. I can think of, for example, the 91 uprising against the Ba'ath regime. And since 2003, since the invasion and occupation, that of course have reshaped a lot of what is Iraq, we had, I mean, it's very important to recall actually that the very first protest that was organized in post-2003 Iraq was a women's protest. It was a protest that was addressing the very questioning of women's legal rights in the frame of the personal status code that many of my colleagues here are familiar with, which is a legal frame that gathers most of women's legal rights. And straight away, straight after the occupation, the political forces, the conservative, sectarian, Islamist political forces that were put in place by the Americans, straight away they started to propose a questioning of women's legal rights on sectarian basis, basically. And this, sectarian basis, this is what we call in Iraq today commonly al-muhasasa system. And so since post-2003, the system that was put in place by the invasion administration is a system in which a communal base is institutionalized. So in Iraq, since 2003, really from the first time in our history, the whole political system is based on ethnic, religious, and sectarian belonging. So if you want to get involved politically, you have to present yourself as a Sunni, a Shi'i, an Arab, a Kurd, a Christian, or a Muslim, right? And this is really, al-muhasasa system is really at the core of everything that happened after 2003, right? It's at the core of the violence we have been experiencing, of course, the 2006-2007 sectarian war that we experienced, and also of the ISIS invasion, the very fragmentation of Iraq according to sectarian lines. And it's also at the core of the institutionalized corruption, right, of these political elites that came from abroad and were imposed from abroad and brought with the Americans. And really the collapse of the state that happened after 2003. Of course, the collapse of the state started under the sanctions, and that's very important to understand the centrality of the sanctions in really destroying what was the best health care infrastructure in the Arab region or in the Arabophone region, the best education system in the region, right? So this is very central. So in Iraq today, basically, you don't have more than a few hours of electricity. You don't have, mostly the population has no access to running water. Really the institution in the infrastructures that are central to people living, to people really surviving, having an everyday life is lacking. Health, education, etc. And this has all been, and thank you for mentioning, of course, privatization. All of you mentioned it in the sense that if you want to have electricity, you pay a private company. If you want to have good education, you go to a private university. So this basically, I mean, Iraqis started rising against the whole, I would say, post-91 situation or post-2003 regime, really in 2011, echoing the Arab uprising. But in 2015, we had really strong movement. The main slogan was Bism al-Din Bagon al-Haramiyya, in the name of religion. We were really robbed by looters, right? And then it started to, the focus was al-Muhasasa. It was kind of articulated politically. But then really 2018, al-Basra, the uprising bil-Basra, which is, such an impoverished province, despite being the province from which 90% of Iraq's oil wealth is extracted. And it's really from al-Basra that we had no to political parties. So no to the whole political establishment. We want a whole new system. No to this green zone system, right? And this important slogan, Nrid Watan. So we want a homeland. And this is really, we want a homeland, is we want a country where we can live with each other, and we can have access to resources, and we have functioning infrastructure. So since October 2019, what we are experiencing is really a people's uprising happening not only at the political level, but really at the societal level. Really people taking back public places. You've seen the pictures of Tahrir Square, Saht al-Haboubi in Nasri in the south, in many cities. So really a direct, of course, response to the privatization of space that has been going on. And people really creating, living, experiencing the society that they want to live in these squares. So like you mentioned also, Muzan, like the paintings, you know, arts, all sorts of arts, also the free distribution of food, health, all kind of cultural services. It's really the development of new state forms, new codes of conduct in these spaces liberated from state control, right? And so, I mean, of course, the protesters also have been asking for very specific things at the political level. So the demands were, let's write a new constitution. Let's appoint a new interim prime minister that is going to organize a new election. Let's have a new government, a new parliament. And very importantly, let's prosecute those who are responsible for the killing of unarmed protesters. And really the bloody repression of the uprising is really the main feature, the main characteristic of the October uprising. We had more than 700 people, unarmed protesters, killed, more than 25,000 people injured. We still have people, hundreds of people who are detained in secret prisons that we haven't heard anything about. People are still, until today, being kidnapped, tortured, threatened by this regime that is actually, I would use, not even a militarized regime. What happened after 2003 is, of course, the militarization of the Iraqi state. But I know I have only 1 minute. Yes, okay. But what happened is really the militiazation of the state. And that was really, I think it became even stronger after the invasion of ISIS, because the state was really armed heavily after the invasion of Daesh. So really, I mean, this is basically the situation that people are paying the price of, this militiazation of the state and kind of a generalization, total normalization of political violence. And I will stop here.
Thanks, Zahra, for all these great insights. You showed us that uprisings are not just isolated events happening in a vacuum, but they are results of or consequence of an accumulation of experiences and different struggles. And Brahim has shown us that those uprisings learn from other revolutions and uprisings in other parts of the world. So these are great. So now we'll move to Rima Majid. So she will be telling us a little bit about the Lebanese uprising. Rima is an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut. Her research focuses on the fields of social inequality, social movements, identity politics, sectarianism, conflict, and violence. Welcome, Rima. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Hamza. Let me start by thanking everyone on this panel and everyone attending today. It's really a great panel, and I think it's also great to talk right after Zahra, because there are so many similarities between Lebanon and Iraq. Of course, many differences as well. But I'll start, I'll also draw a general picture, and I hope in the discussion we can go into more details. And I'll start in a reverse order. I just spent 2 days in the mountains in Lebanon. I just came back this morning, and the country these 2 days is really boiling. We've had a very turbulent evening last night. It's been, the situation has been very difficult in the past weeks. Mobilizations are back, as everywhere else in the world. The pandemic has forced everyone into their houses, and it's a very weird shift from being in the public so intensely to overnight being pushed into the private spaces of our homes. And because it lasted several weeks, it was also a space for many of us to rethink, reconsider what has happened, but also it brought with it a bit of despair. And in the case of Lebanon, because the situation is complex and it looks more difficult by the day, because I think the peculiarity of the Lebanese case is that unlike most other revolutions, it started very clearly because of financial collapse. So I agree with Brahim that Lebanon is, the two main pillars of the Lebanese system is a neoliberal economy, mainly after the end of the civil war in the 1990s, where privatization, became very wide, but also where the state really was rolled back. And this was, the catastrophe of this was very obvious during the pandemic. In a country that was already going through an economic crisis, the state did not interfere, and there was no social protection, which made the situation even worse. So we're talking today about a country where we have more than 30% of youth unemployment. We're talking about more than 55% of the Lebanese population living under poverty line. We are talking about a currency that has devaluated almost sixfolds in the past 6 months. So people have really lost their purchasing power. So it's really a catastrophic scenario. So where did this begin with the revolution? So the economic crisis has been ongoing for a while. It became more seen and felt in the past year, during 2019. Things have started to escalate in September. In October, the beginning, just the week before the uprising started, there was a week of wildfires that had ravaged the country. And I'm saying this because I think the environmental aspect is also important. The previous wave of mass mobilization in Lebanon was in 2015, following a crisis, a garbage crisis. Of course, it's important to historicize. This is a society that is that has historically witnessed a lot of mobilization. So it doesn't come from a void. But there has been, like many other places in the world, since the 90s, very high NGOization. So mainly activism has taken the shape of civil society and non-governmental organizations, less political parties. The labor movement has been very severely and violently crushed during the 90s, specifically after 96. So when the revolution started, that was a week of fires all over the country. An economic situation where there was shortage in dollars, which meant it's also an economy that is not productive. So most of our goods are exported. They could not. So there were talks about shortage in oil or fuel and shortage in bread, which always mobilizes the street. And then there was the famous governmental meeting in which the government decided to impose a new tax on WhatsApp calls. And that was the day when people mobilized in big numbers. Of course, it's not a WhatsApp uprising, but that was the tipping point. So it started with people mobilizing in Beirut, and it very quickly spread to other parts of the country, from the south to the north, different sectarian composition, and it was really unprecedented in its scale and its scope, and it was also very clear in its class composition. That was one time where people were talking a very clear discourse in the street. In a country that is as sectarianized as Lebanon, people were deploying what seemed to me, at least sociologically clear, class-based demands. They were saying the us versus them became us, the people, us, the unemployed, us, the poor, versus the ruling elites. So that was the beginning. And it became massive and spread very quickly. The first week was really like a dream, and what Muzan was describing, the squares became spaces of real utopia. We realized the ideal society we want to live in on squares. But of course, politics is more complex and more complicated. So as the main two demands in the streets, which were important and also show us the development in terms of political awareness. In 2011, when the uprising started in the region, there was a movement in Lebanon that was calling mainly for the downfall of the sectarian regime. So the slogan was, "The people want the downfall of the sectarian regime." 2011, it was "The people want the downfall of the regime." Because people realize that it's not just the sectarian, but it's also very much the neoliberal. It's also very much about what is happening in our economy, our jobs. We are a society that is born to be exported. The main commodity that Lebanon exports is its youth to work abroad. So these became debates that really occupied the public. It was also the second demand was كلهم يعني كلهم, all mean all, and this is, I think, again peculiar to the Lebanese case, maybe also to the Iraqi one, where the system doesn't have one dictator or one head, but because it's a consociational regime. I'll stop in 2 minutes.
1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. So it was to say that we are aware that all of them are one class that we want to get rid of. I just want to highlight quickly that some of the most important, like the groups that played a really important role on the ground, were the feminist groups and the student groups, and that's mainly because, of course, because they've been working in progressive politics for decades, but also because they were the most organized, pre-organized. Many other groups have started to organize during the uprising, which is a very, very difficult task. I'm involved in trying to organize, inspired by the Sudanese experience, professionals association, a professors association. But these are, it's always very difficult to start when things have already started in the streets. So maybe we can go back to the difficulties of organizing, but I think that today we are at a deadlock, and today the question of leadership, which was completely rejected in the streets at the beginning, is something that we really need to think about. What do we want? Who represents us? And how do we move forward? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Reem, and thanks to all the speakers for keeping to the time and for setting the scene with some thought-provoking insights. So now I'd like us to deepen our conversation a bit. So I'll start asking some questions. So these uprisings have been truly inspiring, and all of them released a lot of energy, joy, and creativity. They have also been transformational in the sense that the people discovered their political will and agency for change. But there has been some differences in organizing between these uprisings. So some of them have been mainly horizontal and leaderless, and others had structures and political leaderships propelling those movements. So both aspects, of course, have their positives and negatives. So how has it been in your country, and what do you think about it? So let's start from Muzan, and then Brahim with the same order.
So the organization in Sudan, and as I explained previously, the resistance committees, the neighborhood resistance committees, were vital and essential in organizing the protests and so on. And organizing in neighborhood committees was something that was initiated by the Sudanese Professionals Association, as basically the association asked people to organize those committees. And the direct, at that time, the direct aim was the fact that the emergency state, the state of emergency was announced, and central protests were very difficult. Central announced protests were difficult, and it made more sense strategically and tactically for protesters within every neighborhood to work in such organization. That's how it was during the protest. And during the sitting, it was also the neighborhood committees that organized the sit-in. It was the neighborhood committees that organized communication during the internet shutdown. You have to remember that we organized a millions march around the country from the capital to the IDP camps and the refugee camps without internet connection. That took a lot of on the ground work from the resistance committees. Right now, it's a situation that we're supposed to be forming the new system and the new government. There's a lot of tension regarding the future of those committees. Those committees, as we said, were created geographically, so they do not have a coherent political stance yet, although they're creating it as they are being pushed by the issues that are coming against them. But they're also in a struggle between parts, the government that wants them to become part of the system, and them that want to remain as maybe a political pressure group or so on. But that is still being created. Our people are going on. Yeah, so that is basically the organization form within Sudan.
Brahim?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, it's really, in Algeria, it's really sort of a hybrid sort of form of leadership. So there is the horizontalism in the movement, but there is also sort of quasi-leadership that still remains sort of in line with the horizontal orientation of the movement, or the mode of leadership. So, but I didn't really cover the question of who is sort of involved, and so in Algeria you really. In the last 30 years, especially after the 90s, in which sort of this military oligarchy really decimated, almost 250,000 people were killed. The sort of political life was annihilated. Massive sort of wave of exile and immigration or migration out of the country happened, mainly also in the cadre and the managerial sort of class that had been developed in the previous 3 decades, had to go elsewhere. As Rima was saying, in some ways, Algeria is a subsidizer of multinational companies, that it sort of teaches and trains, engineers and all these with public, with taxpayers' money, and then sends them for free to work for these sort of foreign capital, and in some ways come back as representatives or native informants for this capital. So, but what happened because of the closing of the political scene in Algeria in the last 30 years, you obviously had, or naturally had, organizing happening in the diaspora, and that's where we start seeing sort of political formations in the diaspora coming together, and sort of media and sort of the using satellite television, using new medias and new technologies to go over, or to break the monopoly of the oligarchy over sort of media outlets to speak directly to the people. So there is that sort of side of it, which might look vertical, but organizing on the ground also happens. Movements on the ground. You have youth. The average age in Algeria is 27 years. So it's a young country, and so you have. Employment amongst the youth hovers around 50%. Just one of their ministers a couple of weeks ago declared that 8.5 million Algerians live in squalor, And this is in a country, in an oil-rich country, in a country that had a revenue over the last 2 decades of over $1 trillion. You know, and so people are asking, where is that? Why aren't we seeing this? Why don't we see it when we go to our hospitals? Why don't we see it when we go to our schools? Well, you know, why are our roads in the state that they are in? And where is public transportation? Where are the buses? Where are the trains? And so on and so forth. So there is that, but there's also, we've seen, and it has become clearer under the so-called COVID-19 crisis, where the state is totally absent. And maybe we can talk about that in a little bit, why it's absent and so on. But we see how these unofficial neighborhood committees are sort of coming together for food distribution, care and support for the elderly, making sure that the elderly don't leave their homes, that they do their groceries for them. You know, they're distributing, sort of collecting and distributing sort of essential materials and food to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods and so on. That also can be witnessed if anyone watches sort of the live feeds of the Friday protests, the weekly protest in Algeria. You can see how different contingents of the protest converge on just in Algiers, for example, how they converge on the city center. So you have these sort of contingents that are formed and organized in different neighborhoods and then move together and converge in central Algiers. You wanted me to stop, Hamza? Is that the
Yes, it is. Zahra.
Yes, so there's a lot to say about that, but I would start by simply saying that this uprising is different because it's really, I mean, people who are, if I compare it to the other countries, of course, we also have a population that is predominantly young. And I would say that in Iraq, this uprising is the uprising of the people, but it was really launched, and those who are at the core of it are very young, actually, you know, from the age of 15 years old to really the early 20s. So there is something that is a generational difference as well. So it's not like the 2015 uprising that was launched by people who were in the kind of late 20s, early 30s. And I think that's very important because that shows that they have a totally different political experience, a total different imaginary also of trauma when you are, 18 years old. When you are 18 years old, I mean, you were born basically knowing the sectarian war. You were born, you don't know anything about the Ba'ath regime, for example. You haven't shared the trauma of Saddam's regime. So you have a very different perspective, right? What you see is a political elite that is corrupted, is really a whole political system that is really dysfunctional. And what is also very important is that we haven't had a case where you had the underprivileged and impoverished. You've seen in the picture, the heroes of the uprising are the tuk-tuk drivers. You know, also the ones who carry wood carts, you know, the ones who are paid daily jobs every day in the big cities, the ones who are selling vegetables and all kinds of objects. So really people who are not necessarily very educated, who have really a poor access or a total absence of access to a certain type of resources that the rising kind of middle class has. And these people are still at the core of the uprising. And a very, very important aspect as well is that so there is a refusal to organize until now. I mean, of course, now there are voices that call for, okay, we need to now organize lists. If we want to organize elections, we need to organize into lists, independent lists, etc. However, protesters are also aware of what happened in the last movement of protests, when we had basically an alliance of leftist activists, mostly members of the Iraqi Communist Party, allying with the Sadrist movement, which is definitely, used to kind of be composed of most of the impoverished, etc. However, the Sadrists, this alliance between the Sadrists and the communists that was, pretty interesting at the beginning, really became the co-optation of the movement. And then it turns into basically a list that candidated for the 2018 election, which was a big joke. The 2018 election was a big joke, and everyone knows that in Iraq. So I think that the fear that if we organize, if we basically create coalition, the Sadrist movement or certain movement are going to take over is really something that is important. And the very rejection maybe of politics generally, like of election politics, is also something, I guess, that is very important. And we see it, I think that the only kind of party, and this is actually what protesters have been saying, like our only party is the party of a shuhada, of the martyrs of the protest. If we have a party, it's the party of the shuhada. Those are basically a shuhada are the slogan, right? We are here. So it's as if we're not even here for for basically the list of political demands. Now we are here to honor our martyrs, right? And this is also why, despite COVID-19, we have still Bil Basra, Bil Nasriya, Bil Najaf, Karbala, a little bit less in Baghdad, because of course the roads are now closed and the lockdown is pretty strong, but we still have spontaneous protests, mostly asking for the release of somebody who has been kidnapped by a militia, and mostly really emphasizing on the fact that we want justice for those who have been killed, for those unarmed protesters who have been killed. So far, this is where it's going.
Thank you, Zahra. Rima, can you be brief, please?
Yeah, this is the price when you're last. I'll be brief. So it's, again, there are lots of similarities with Iraq. There's a rejection of the idea of having leadership, of organizing, and it's mainly because of the connotation around the word political party or politics in general. Politics has a negative connotation, and anyone who wants to do politics is frowned at, which is something that tells us a lot about the general political culture, which I think is in itself a result of this neoliberalized life we live in. And this can also be seen or traced in the names of the different groups that are active, which I think both in Lebanon and Iraq it's really impressive how the most active groups, and this is of course not to judge them, most of them are really the most active groups on the grounds, but the names, like whether it's very much linked to the I, an individual. So Beirut Medinati li haqqi, so Beirut my city, for my rights. In Iraq it was Nazal akhud haqqi. So it's about the individual and rights, legal rights, which in the context of both Lebanon and Iraq, somehow, in countries where the judicial system is no one trusts it, is weird. Why are people deploying this kind of narrative that is somehow detached from the realities that we live? But in terms of rights, but in terms of the individualization of the struggles, and as I said, decades of NGOization, and again, I'm not saying this from a standpoint of judging those organizations, but to understand how it has unfolded. We are no longer talking about a period where there's money that comes for political parties, right? We're no longer in the 60s, and I mean, there's a very serious question that we ought to ask ourselves when we talk about the fragmented left, the inability to organize. The inability to organize is not just that we don't want to organize, it's also because it's very difficult to organize. And the resources that we have do not allow us. It's a full-time job if you really want to do this, right? And this is why it has taken these different forms. So I think it's important for us to think about how unions have been co-opted, and which explains in many cases in the Lebanese context why blocking roads was the tipping point of the revolution. And this is because we were unable to call for a general strike because we don't have the unions and the syndicates so we had to physically block the country in order to stop the wheel. So I think these are important questions and very difficult ones in terms of how do we move forward? How do we think about organizing given the structures we live under and what it means? And this is where I say that the two movements that have shown us some hope are the feminist one and the student movement, because they were the most organized and they have accumulated this organization over the years. And they already had their internal mechanisms of taking decisions. This whole debate about we don't want leadership, we don't want hierarchies, we want, horizontal organization. It's difficult to have these debates while at the same time you are debating whether the army is going to, to kill us in the streets, or whether, and when you have friends and comrades who are in prison. So it's very difficult to do all of this at once. And this is why I think this is a process and this is long-term, and we need to learn and to think and to be creative in terms of how do we organize and how do we move forward.
Thanks, Rima. We have a lot of questions, so before I take 2 or 3, unfortunately we cannot take all of them. I have one important question to ask. So we've seen in those uprisings that despite the rejection of foreign interferences, and in the Algerian case, clear anti-neo-colonial politics, these movements find themselves confronted with counter-revolutionary forces at the local, regional, and global level. So, and this is not just happening at the political, but it's happening at the economic and ideational level. First, can you talk briefly about some of the manifestations of the counter-revolution in the uprisings in your countries, and tell us about the impact of the proxy and conflicts, wars in Iraq and Libya on the uprisings. So let's start with Muzan.
Sure. So, well, in Sudan, the regional and global counter-revolutionary forces, they showed their most shameless faces during the time of the negotiations, as they supported the negotiations and the power sharing agreement with the Transitional Military Council, even after the massacre, and even after the Sudanese people showed their will and their insistence to realize the civilian ruling with the strike, the general political strike of May 28th and May 29th. But the thing is, this support from the global players or the foreign interference for tyranny and for the political ruling in Sudan is not new. It is not at all. I mean, UAE and the Saudis have funded and backed Bashir for child soldiers for their war in Yemen. The EU, the European Union, has funded the Janjaweed, the RSF militia, as part of their Khartoum process to control the borders in Africa. Germany has funded Bashir's national dialogue for a while. So they've supported the previous tyranny and they will support the next tyranny. And that is, that is not a surprise at all. But what I'm most interested in talking about at this moment is that how I see it is that the moment of foreign interference, we all know, whether it comes as a statement from the State Department in America, or it comes as a call for negotiation from the African Union, or however this interference comes, it is a moment of escalation in the process itself. However, we did not, as the people, we did not provide a counter tool for this moment. How do we make sure that we keep ourselves still relevant and at the table once it's now moved from, it's no longer a fight between us and the police. It's somehow a fight between, countries, and maybe 2-3 countries discussing another 4th country. So how do we keep ourselves there? And I believe that the only way that we can keep ourselves relevant at this moment is, well, it's a global system that is supporting each other. Then the only way to fight it is a global resistance. that supports each other. And that is not very irrational. That has happened before in the region. Only in 2018, we had the case, for example, in South Africa, where the South African dock workers refused to unload a ship of arms that was coming from China to Zimbabwe. And all the countries that were surrounding Zimbabwe at that time, all the dock workers refused because they saw it as they are aiding the oppression of the Zimbabwean protesters who were protesting at that time. And at that time, in 2018, the Chinese ship actually went back to China. And that was us as a global resistance coming together against the global system. So that is doable. That can be done. I personally dream of one day seeing, and across Red Sea ports, a strike that is across all the Red Sea ports. But it doesn't have to be this way. It just has to be that we need to keep an open mind and an open imagination for the fact that no revolution can be successful as a national one. That does not happen, and it has never happened. We need to extend this kind of basically of cooperations. It has to be a global resistance, and that's the only way we can deal with a global system that supports itself.
Thanks, Muzan. Rahim?
Yeah, I think the counter-revolution, thinking about it again, as I had previously sort of tried to argue, is to think about it at these levels, sort of the global, the regional, and the local. Locally speaking, remember, and it's I won't be teaching you anything. It's a well-known rule for a nation state that your legitimacy, you either get it from your people or you get it from the inside or from the outside, from external actors. And that's the case for an illegitimate sort of military oligarchy that has its people sort of rising against it. It will run and make, it'll have to throw itself into the arms of its foreign backers. And so the goal for them is to rebuild the wall of fear that was there before February 2019, and they are trying to do that by repression. They've been sort of passing, they've amended the penal code to sort of add these sort of elastic infractions which could be applied liberally to anyone who actually says no. And they have been sort of arresting people in the context of COVID-19. They have been arresting them for sort of a simple critical Facebook post, and some of them have been charged and imprisoned for 18 months for that. So remember that when empires, again, I always say that when empires have make plans, they rarely actually give up on them. They may get shelved, but they will always be taken out of the shelf and implemented in one way or another. So talks in the early, as Zahra was saying earlier, in the early 2000s, talks of a new Middle East, it's not just talk. That's an imperial project, to break the Middle East into stateless. It's not a project just for the neocons or the new American century. It's a project, it's one of the projects, a proposition for 21st century US empire. And that we see that happening. De facto sort of division in Syria. We see the de facto division in Iraq, in Yemen. We see the actual division and partitioning of Sudan in 2011, and de facto division of Libya. And Algerians are very aware that Algeria is not sort of out of the pale, but similar designs are there. So imperial sort of designs, Zionist designs also in the region are at play. And those, so you have the US and sort of Europe are the representatives of that at the global level. At the regional level, you have of course Israel and the Gulf states, especially the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and now Egypt. Algeria, the Algerian regime has been key also in providing cover It was key. Algeria played a key role in keeping Egypt in the African Union after the Sisi's coup by buying off, you know, multiple African countries or leaders to make sure that it doesn't get labeled as a coup. So Egypt remains. So it had, you know, its diplomatic activism on the African continent and the UN was key. And now it's you know, they're coming back to collect those favors so that's how we see that, you know, going back to the point that your legitimacy, if you don't have the support of your people, your legitimacy comes from outside. They have to make more concessions. Remember that until now, 16 months later, not a single country, and this one of the one of the most prominent opposition leaders, Algerian opposition, keeps reminding us that not a single country has made a statement about the Algerian uprising, official statement. Not a single country has made a critique, said anything about it. You can go over the last 16 months and look for any official statements from any country in the world about Algeria. Always there are those who are for and against, in Libya, in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Algeria, none. There is sort of a total consensus that the status quo needs to be ought to be maintained, and that's because over the last 2 decades, everyone had a piece of the cake, everyone. And the counter-revolution, and I know this is the last point that I'm going to make, how it's the next concession that they are trying to get out of Algeria is precisely to turn its military into a militia with which to recolonize the African continent, or at least parts of the African continent. They are trying now to push them to change the constitution and allow for the Algerian military to be deployed beyond its borders, so they can use it as a mercenary force for the French and the Americans to use it as a mercenary force in the Sahel region, in Mali, in Niger, you know, and beyond, also in Libya. So that's, you know, the concessions, they've made economic concessions in terms of opening up the liberalizing the investment code, opening up the hydrocarbon sector for the big 5 oil companies and so on. But there are also geostrategic and military concessions that they are making right now. So they want to recolonize the African continent with sons and daughters.
Thanks, Brahim. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll ask a specific question for Zahra. So can you tell us about the impact of the proxy conflict and war between the US and Iran in Iraq and its impact on the uprising?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just say something about this, the counter-revolutionary forces, etc. I mean, and also I go back to something. So post-2003 is, of course, the US imperialist invasion and occupation, but I would say, ironically, what has happened since 2003 is that Iraq has been dominated by Iran, actually. It's like the Americans had just handed Iraq to a hegemony, an economic, a political hegemony of Iran, and it's true, and it's true also in Iran's support of various militias that have been killing protesters and repressing the various types of protests in Iraq and civil society activism in Iraq, and so I guess it's also my way to say that when we write or when we discuss or when we reflect on imperialism on the ground is so much more complex, and I'm thinking also of the images that I've seen circulating in the social media. So I was actually in Baghdad when the whole strike, the American when the Americans killed Soleimani, and I realized that you know, I mean, on the ground, most people were completely aware of the fact that the Iraqi government kind of show around its anti-Americanism was a masrahiyya. It was really a play. It was a big play, right? In the sense that it is a political elite that is very pro-Iranian, but that was nevertheless brought by the Americans, right? And is still tied and is still, of course, not free to decide of the future of the country. So when we saw these images, it's interesting because on social media, you would see the classic anti-imperialist person seeing this Sadrist and this also Islamist organizing this rally for the end of the U.S. domination on the country, or for excluding the U.S. forces of the country. I mean, this is really, we really have to look at things in more details and in more complexity than that. This is really a show, a ridiculous show, right? And actually this is, I mean, the protesters have been very, very clear about the fact that they refuse any kind of interference, Americans, I mean, or Iranians, and they want to stay away from that kind of, and they want to redefine what politics is. They really want to reappropriate. There's a lot of discussion around we are Iraq's sovereignty. So the political elite is not doing anything to preserve Iraq's sovereignty, right? And we, the protesters, or we, the uprising, we are reclaiming this sovereignty. And I think that's very extremely important. I also want to say something, because I've seen in the chat, and I'm very sorry that I'm taking the liberty to look at the questions. There's an interesting question around the use of the term Arab, and I think it's important. And I like the fact that Muzan, you started with this notion just to get us a little bit out of the geopolitics that I'm not a big fan of, but talk about very essential things. You know, it's true. We need to, and I think the uprisings have been, actually, it's not an Arab nationalist uprising. It's not. It's uprisings of the people, right? It's protests of the people, right? And I think maybe using Arabophone or using other terms is really important. And unfortunately, in the case of Iraq, the fragmentation is happening. We have a territory that is divided, right? However, around these very basic issues, around issues of access to services, around issues of access to resources, I think all Iraqis agree in Iraqi Kurdistan, in the Sunni-dominated El Anbar, and in the Shia-dominated South, particularly also because, and I think that's very interesting, because yes, it's true, at the very beginning of the invasion, some, part of the Shia population that has been really discriminated against, and the Kurdish as well, that has been oppressed under Saddam, kind of had this hope that, for example, the South will be reconstructed after, years of neglect. But this is absolutely not what happened. Is that this Kurdish Shia elite that came in power with the US completely neglected their own population, right? In Kurdistan, in being very authoritarian and corrupt, and the same in the Shia South. So because, I guess because of that as well, we have people articulating registers of rights, of issues of dignities outside of this Arab or sectarian identity politics.
Thanks, Zahra. Rima, we don't have the time for you to answer this question, but there is another question on sectarianism and ethnic strife. Can you tell us how it has played out in Lebanon during the uprising? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Great. Thank you, Hamza, for this question. I think it answers both questions. And also, I'm seeing the chats, and I'm sorry, we can't answer everyone. I agree. Of course, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Morocco, these are all very interesting and important cases to talk about. But the time is very limited. In the case of Lebanon, the questions about sectarianism is this term that is so charged and so you know, so ill-defined. We don't really know what we're talking about when we say sectarianism, because it could be many different things. I prefer the word sectarianization because I think the counter-revolution in Lebanon is a process of sectarianization, and we've seen this in the past month with sectarian political parties mobilizing. So the streets are co-opted by those parties, and this is why I'm saying today it's difficult, and today the picture is grim. The hopes of the beginnings now are turned into dangerous moments where many of us feel that the streets can really go out of control at any moment. And this is because of heightened sectarianization in the discourse. And sectarianism, of course, there's an affective side, and someone mentioned something about emotions, but it's also about the political economy of sectarianism, right? Why do people follow those leaders? And when we don't have a welfare state, when the state does not provide, when what we have is a non-state welfare through those leaders, it becomes a very complex picture where it's not just that people are blind followers, but it's also about survival. And in times of economic crisis, what do we have to promise, you know, in the absence of the state? So in that sense, yes, sectarianism is a counter-revolutionary tool that is used to co-opt the streets, to mobilize and to divide the movement, to mobilize people against each other. But it's also about the cracks that exist in the Lebanese system today amongst the different groups. And it's not it's not sectarian in the sense that it's the Sunnis against the Shias. There are inter and intra-sectarian alliances that are built, and it's more about the interest of how do they reproduce a certain class of leaders who have been, you know, since at least 30 years, but I would say even more, that have been in control of the country. So there's that on one hand. On the other hand, there's the legal sectarianism. So the country is our constitution is a corporate consociational democracy whereby the seats are divided according to a sectarian quota. And the quota here is not a positive discrimination. It's not a quota for groups that are historically, you know, underprivileged. It's a quota for the most powerful. So it's the quota for the biggest sectarian groups. It's a quota for, so it's not a system, it's not even a system of the question of a representation of minorities. It's a representation of majorities. And therefore, it's a very regressive system. And this is why I think one of the main demands should be a new constitution. There's no revolution without a new constitution. And this is one absent demand, although we've debated this within activist circles for long hours. But it's a demand that everyone is scared of because people feel that sectarianism is just culture and that people are not ready to move beyond it. And I mean, as a sociologist who works on sectarianism, I would bet to differ. We need to, sectarianism is a complex system, but it has its roots in its political economy, in its everyday, that is very much entrenched within a system of neoliberalism that makes survival in this country impossible outside of the realms of these, you know, very complex sectarian networks.
Thanks, Rima. I'll try to squeeze in a few more questions. Muzan, this is for you. Can you give us more details about the reasons of the uprising in Sudan, economic, political, and do you see a clear or even settled anti-capitalism or anti-imperialist discourse in the Sudanese uprising? I think it's a complicated question to address in 2 minutes, but you have only 2 minutes.
We'll try my best. So yeah, the economical reasons will be the one, you know, they were the last straw, as I said, the increase of bread prices. But the reason that made this increase so, you know, harmful to the people's life is years of inflation that was before that were due to years of mismanaging resources and also of using resources as a political tool between the different groups that are competing on limited resources. And again, this was a dictatorship that started 30 years ago, and the resistance did start 30 years ago, and it did take 30 years of accumulation. I do not know of a day or a month that passed in Sudan in the past 30 years without some kind of protesting in one way or another. So that was all always there. And then there was, of course, the economical part that was the last straw. Now, the question about whether there were anti-capitalist trends within the movement, I wouldn't say that there were. But I would definitely say that the government, the transitional government, given that it started pushing the same economical politics of the previous regime, it got people to go beyond the discussion of this is the Kazan, this is the regime we don't like, to what is it about these politics that we don't like? And it seems that this new government is coming with the same politics. So there's more theorizing that is happening due to what the government had been pushing on the people. I would say that if it wasn't for that, it wasn't for the discussions that we're having around the budget, as well as the whether we're going to have an economic conference to discuss the issues of Sudan, I would say that this uprising would have passed without having this discussion. And maybe this is the good thing about having such horrible political policies being pushed by the transitional government.
Thanks a lot, Muzan. And I have a specific question for Zahra. So why did the protests in Iraq seem focused in the south and Shia regions, not spreading to other ethnic or Sunni areas? So the
important question. Yeah,
they are wondering, does it signal a break in Iraqi identity?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I mean, so when we think about Iraqi Kurdistan, I have to say that the dynamics of Iraqi Kurdistan has been very different, and it takes its own kind of process, and really not only since 2003, but since 91, since this part of Iraq's territory has been managed by Kurdish authorities, right? So, however, I mean, in 2011, there was in Midan, in Slemaniya, there was the Midani Azadi protest, and there were protests happening actually in Kurdistan, and echoing also the protests happening in the rest of Iraq. There were in 2012 and 2013 absolutely massive protests in the region of Iraq that is a Sunni-dominated region of El Anbar. And unfortunately, and there was some support in the country generally to these protests, but unfortunately, the war on terror narrative was really used against protesters in El Anbar to portray them as terrorists, and then later on until today, I think if you want to demonstrate in El Anbar, you really are threatened in being called a pro-Daesh supporter, for example. So this is really a tool that has been used by the Iraqi authorities to repress any kind of protest in these regions, right? And the protest in El Anbar, that was not a sectarian protest at all. It was a general, I mean, a protest for the bettering of the conditions of life, was repressed really in blood under the Maliki regime. So really, if you want to get involved in these regions of Iraq, you really any Iraqi is actually in danger of losing their life. But in El Anbar, I think the danger is even stronger. And of course, in the north, the population of El Mosul is just also surviving the invasion of Daesh and the war against Daesh, the destruction provoked by the war against Daesh itself as well. So for sure, it's been, and this is also why I guess some analysts are saying that it's an intra-Shia uprising or protest movement that is going on. And this is why it's not anymore at all about sectarianism. It's really about the whole system, because you have the South that is predominantly Shia, that is rising and using even, that is incredible. It's really using the Shia religious imaginary that were used, for example, against Saddam in the 90s, against a Shia regime. So this is something extremely important to keep in mind.
Thanks, Zahra. Brahim, this question is for you. There were a lot of popular uprisings in many countries around the world last year, from Hong Kong to South America. You mentioned Chile, and I think also in the current context of an inspiring global revolt, against anti-Black racism. So maybe we can have some thoughts from you around possible convergences between the struggles. Can we these struggles as a common one? Can we build revolutionary linkages and transnational solidarity between them? 2 minutes, Brahim.
Absolutely. I think, look, when it comes to, there is always, we need to sort of, there's always a conversation happening. You know, in one of the main slogans of the Algerian uprising is "Yitnahaw ga." They must all be wrenched, or and you have the iteration of that "ga yani ga," which means all. Later on, we see an iteration of that in Lebanon, kullun yani kullun, and then in December 2019, we see it in the US, and now say remove them all. I didn't send. I had these photos to share with you, but I wasn't, since I wasn't going to be in control of when to show them. I thought maybe, maybe I can send them later on, and if they can be added. But you can see also on the on the reverse, while sort of movements in the US are sort of listening to what's happening in the rest of the world, in Lebanon, in Algeria, and there is a reverse. So it's a two-way street. I have a caricature of an Algerian caricaturist who has Algeria sort of being stepped upon or restrained by a knee in military fatigues, and it says, "I can't breathe since 1962." So the critique of military rule, that military rule has had its foot or its knee on Algeria's neck since 62, and that's sort of a hint, So we haven't had really time to talk much about cultural production and the sort of the key importance of revolutionary culture in all of this, but it manifests itself in those ways. Now, at least in Algeria and the US, they are very, in many ways, they're very similar. They are both in the sense that they are both settler colonies. So the US just happens to be, from the perspective of a white colonist, a successful one. In that, so Algerians, in many ways, the colonial experience that Algerians have is more comparable to indigenous communities in the US, in the same way that, and the case of Palestine. And remember that how resistance, power is global and thinks globally and acts globally. What is usually referred to as the French school of counterinsurgency, tactics and the sort of technologies of repression that were developed in the 40s and 50s in Algeria, the forms of torture and so on, they were taught later on in Buenos Aires, in Honduras, in Latin American academies, military academies in the United States. Just in 2003, before the invasion of Iraq, they were showing in the Pentagon, they were showing the Battle of Algiers. So those technologies tend to be of repression, tend to be sort of developed in colonial contexts, and we see it today. This restraining position that with the knee on someone's neck, that's a daily occurrence in Palestine. So these technologies of repression and oppression tend to be developed in colonial contexts, and Palestine happens to be today the sort of foremost lab for the development of this. And we see that happening in Algeria. We see in December. I also have a picture of a woman being restrained in Algiers in 2019 in the same way. And so these oppressive regimes sort of learn from one another, and they transfer, they share. There is a shared sort of shared imaginary, not only imaginary, but actual practices. Police departments, U.S. police departments, the NYPD actually gets trained by Israeli in Israel. So power thinks global and acts global, and I think resistance, is getting out of the old adage of the late 1990s of think global and act local, and now I think resistance is starting to think global and act global.
Great, Brahim. This has been a truly fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time to delve into more details and answer all your questions. I know we just scratched the surface. Tia and I will be publishing a book with Daraja Press on mapping some of the uprisings that happened in the region in North Africa and West Asia. I think it will be out in September, so be on the lookout for it. We will be organizing another great webinar next Wednesday about a very important theme, about walls that must fall and in the deadly politics of border militarization. So do register using the link on the chat. I think Sean will be maybe he has already done so. As I said at the start, TNI offers these webinars and its research for free. And as you know, it takes time and a lot of resources. So we'll be grateful if you can support our work by donating through the link you see now on the screen and in the chat. Finally, I'd like to thank all the speakers, Muzan, Brahim, Rima, and Zahra. You have been truly great. Thanks to Jess, Katie, and Sean for making this webinar run smoothly. And thanks to all our audience for joining us. Goodbye.